Thank you to all the alumni and friends who've joined us here today to discuss the steps the nation has taken since 2016 to enhance election security and access, and as we learn more about what we might expect from this November's election. I'm thrilled to be joined today by two remarkable experts in their respective fields. Dan Boneh is a computer scientist in the School of Engineering with the science fiction-worthy title of Cryptography Professor and Professor of Electrical Engineering. His work includes crypto systems with novel properties, web security, security for mobile devices, and cryptanalysis. If anyone is interested in learning about cryptography, Dan teaches a massive open online course available on Coursera. Nate Persily is the James B. McClatchy Professor of Law at Stanford Law School and also a graduate from Stanford Law. Nate specializes in American election law, addressing issues such as voting rights and First Amendment issues. He served as the Senior Research Director for the Bipartisan Commission on Election Reform. He recently founded healthyelections.org, the Stanford MIT project on healthy elections, which aims to support local election officials in taking the necessary steps during the COVID-19 pandemic to provide safe voting options for the 2020 election. Together, Dan and Nate co-direct the Cyber Policy Center in the Friedman Spogli Institute for International Studies. So welcome, Dan and Nate. Please unmute yourselves. Dan, I'd like to start with you first to help lay some of the technical groundwork for our discussion. To begin, first, what are some of the current innovations in election technology for internet voting and mobile voting, and why are we still unable to vote online in federal elections?
Wow. Okay, that's a packed, a loaded question. So I think I'm gonna try and unpack this question and step back for just a minute before I answer it. But first of all, let me thank first of all the Alumni Association, School of Engineering, and the Law School for organizing this event. This is a very timely topic. So thank you all for joining us, and thank you for organizing this. So like Jenny said, I'm a computer science professor. I work on computer security and cryptography. But of course, when it comes to election security, there is both a technical aspect to the question as well as a policy aspect. So I work on I'm going to focus only on the technical aspect, and Nate is going to focus on more of the policy and legal aspects. So Nate and I complement each other very well, and it's wonderful to be co-directing our Center on Cyber Policy with Nate. We complement each other quite well. So if we dive into the technical question, the first question to ask is, why is election security even an interesting technical question for us to work on? If you think about it for a second, there's a very easy solution to elections, which is basically just a spreadsheet. Yeah, everybody just casts their votes. We capture everybody's votes in a spreadsheet. We publish a spreadsheet, and now everybody who voted can look at the spreadsheet and see that their vote appears correctly on the spreadsheet, that the tally was computed correctly, and that everybody who's on the spreadsheet is actually authorized to vote. And then we're done, right? So then if we could capture a vote in a spreadsheet, basically the problem from a technical point of view is not that interesting. But of course, you know that we can't publish a spreadsheet of the election because there are very strong secrecy requirements, right? Your vote is secret. Only you should know who you voted for. And that's actually a really, really important property. It's a very good idea because it prevents coercion, right? So if we voted on a spreadsheet, your employer could ask to see how you voted, your spouse could ask to see how you voted, the government might be interested in seeing how you voted. And so there's very strong secrecy requirements. And that makes it actually into a very interesting technical question, right? If you think about it for a minute, the question is, how, even as an individual, how do you verify that your vote was captured correctly if no one can see how you voted? In particular, the system should never, ever show you how it counted your vote, how it captured your vote, because if the system showed you how your vote was captured, that could be used for coercion, right? Again, your employer could ask to see how you voted, how the system captured your vote, and that could be used to coerce votes. And so we want to have a strong secrecy requirement, and that seems like contradictory requirements. On the one hand, you need to be able to verify that your vote was captured correctly, and at the same time, the system cannot show you how you voted because of the secrecy requirements. So how do you verify that your vote was captured correctly? And that's a really beautiful technical question. And the whole field of cryptography is basically there to help make this possible. Yeah, it's there to resolve these seemingly conflicting requirements. And so I have to say that, like, cryptographic voting is not something new. This has been something that's been in development from the 1980s. So it started with the work of David Chaum and Josh Benelo and Ron Rivest and later Benedita and so on and so forth. There are many people who worked on cryptographic voting. It's really quite a fascinating area of how to use cryptography correctly to have a verifiable vote. So again, Jenny, before I answer your question, I do want to step back 1 second just to kind of set the frame, to set the stage to what is it that we're trying to achieve in an election system. So what are the security goals for an election system? And really there are kind of 6 goals that we'd like to support, right? So the first one is availability, which means that anyone who wants to vote should be able to vote. Availability. Authenticity, only people who are authorized to vote can vote. Secrecy, which we just talked about, which means, again, nobody knows how you voted. Not your spouse, not your employer, not the government. Nobody knows how you voted. And then the ballot should be cast as intended. So the system should correctly record your intention. The ballot should be counted as cast. And then the last property is not a technical property. The last property is legitimacy of the election system, which is to say that the public should have faith that the election system is working correctly. And again, that's actually much more in the policy side of things. So I'm going to let Nate actually talk about the legitimacy of the election system and how the public perceives it. Now, the current technology, I guess you asked about innovation. Before we talk about innovation, we just have to quickly go through the current technology. And so the current technology is actually, there's a fairly large industry that supports the current election, that provides current election technology. So these are companies like Clear Ballots and ESNS and HART and Dominion and AccuVote. It's a fairly large set of companies that all provide basically counties with equipment that they can use in the election process. Now, of course, as you know, there are multiple types of ways to vote. You can vote at the polling place, and there's technology that's being used for voting at the polling place. I think maybe we'll talk about security of technology for the voting place maybe later on during the session. There are lots of points to bring up there. This is a pretty interesting topic, and so I hope we'll dig into that a bit later. Of course, in this election, there's going to be a lot more vote by mail, and there's a set of technologies that are being used for vote by mail, systems for printing the ballots, systems for scanning the ballots, and well, there are a lot of security issues with that as well. So, for example, systems that scan ballots. Well, what can I say? We're going to talk about various. Hopefully, later on, we'll talk about various security issues with those scanners. One of the things that's really important to do, though, in addition to just capturing the vote during election day, is also what's called post-election audits. Okay, and that cannot be understated how important that is. So once the polls close, in fact, multiple states now mandate post-election audits, and there are many different ways of doing post-election audits, from randomly sampling a subset of the votes of the ballots and manually inspecting that those were captured correctly, all the way to a full recount. And again, Nate can talk more about the procedures that are necessary for post-election audits. Again, there are interesting technical security questions there, and I hope we'll get to that again during this hour. Okay, so now, Jenny, now that we've set the stage, I can actually come back to your question finally. Sorry for taking a while. So you asked about 2 questions. One was innovations in election technology, and the other one was about online voting. So both are, really fantastic questions and big topics in their own right. So the first one I'll talk about is innovations, and then one of the important technical developments is what's called end-to-end verifiable voting. Yeah, so end-to-end verifiable voting. It's a very important concept, not yet deployed, but hopefully will be deployed at some point in the future. And again, just to give you an idea for systems that do this, so there's a system called Helios that provides this capability. Microsoft recently developed a system called Election Guard that does this quite well. There are other systems like Scantegrity and others that also provide end-to-end verifiable voting. So what's the idea behind end-to-end verifiable voting? The idea is that effectively you cast your vote, your ballot, wherever you might be. And then the point is, you can later verify that your vote was correctly cast and correctly counted, again, without being able to ever prove to anybody else what your vote actually was. Okay, so that's the individual verifiability property. And again, I would love to tell you how this works. Yeah, so I really hope we have time to get into the technology of how end-to-end verifiable voting works, because it's really, really beautiful cryptographic ideas. So please ask somebody. I really hope somebody asks, so I have an opportunity to explain how this works. So these systems that provide end-to-end verifiable voting both provide individual verifiability, so you can verify that your vote was cast correctly, counted correctly, without ever you being able to prove to anyone how you voted. And then it also provides universal verifiability, which means that we can make sure that the tally overall was done correctly. Yeah, and there's additional defenses against ballot stuffing and other sort of standard attacks. Okay, so the goal basically is to detect in these systems, the goal is to detect misbehavior. So if if the system somehow has been hacked and somehow votes were cast incorrectly, end-to-end verifiability will catch that. Okay, so we'll be alerted that somehow the vote was done improperly. Then, of course, somebody should ask, well, what do we do then? Right, so suppose the vote was there was tampering in the election and the end-to-end verifiable voting actually showed us that there was tampering. What do we do then? Well, again, then I'm going to actually take the easy way out, and I'm just going to throw it over to Nate. And I'm going to let Nate answer that, because then it really becomes a question for the courts, right? So the courts, basically, if the voting system, the cryptography shows us that something went wrong, well, then the courts have to get involved. So Nate, I'm going to leave the hard question to you.
Nate,
Okay,
you can tackle that. And I want to ask you another thing as well, Nate, which is beyond the computer systems being hacked in terms of the votes themselves, can outsiders interfere in our elections by hacking the voters? That is, to what extent did Russia in 2016 pollute the information ecosystem? And are we still vulnerable to that in 2020?
Well, thanks very much, Jenny. And let me add my thanks to all the various Stanford institutions that are putting this on. So there's a lot there, both in what Dan said and what you asked. Let me focus on your question. And as you said, we can think of bad actors as hacking the systems, right? The way that we vote, or hacking people, right? That different individuals may be subject to disinformation and as a result may vote in a particular way. Now, one of those threatens the legitimacy of the election more than others. And I want to emphasize that the cybersecurity problems are the ones that I think, pose a kind of critical infrastructural problem, as opposed to drawing the lines at what are permissible and impermissible forms of persuasion over voting, right? And that sort of is a seed to the larger problem here of trying to figure out how do we draw the lines as to over what is permissible and impermissible campaign activity. Now, you raised the issue of the Russian intervention in the 2016 election, and that is sort of the lens through which we view so much of this questionable content that's online. And we know from the Mueller report, let alone other investigations since then, that the Russians participated actively in the 2016 election, both in supporting a candidate, but also in raising all kinds of divisive social issues. They did that through the many affordances of the various platforms, and all of them all the main platforms were used. And they did it through paid communication, and they did it through organic content and the like. And so in many ways, what the Russians did was not unique to foreign activity. And one of the lessons I think that we've learned since then is that it's becoming increasingly difficult to distinguish between, say, illegal foreign activity and legitimate domestic activity when it comes to persuasion. So if you look, for example, at most of the Russian advertisements, about 80% of them were not false. Okay, and so what I mean by that is that they weren't necessarily fake news. They weren't making arguments. They were either sort of inflammatory, even satirical communications, or they were sort of advertisements on divisive social issues that were reflecting what was happening in the domestic environment, like issues of race and religion and gun rights and the like. And so, so that's the first thing, which is that it's becoming increasingly difficult to distinguish these lines. And those lines, it's not just between what is foreign and domestic content. And if you talk to the folks at the platforms right now, it is becoming very difficult to figure out where some of this propagandizing begins and ends. But it's also between who's in part of the campaign and who's on the outside of the campaign, right? Insiders and outsiders. It's really difficult to distinguish. Who's the media and who's not the media. This has become very relevant in the realm of political advertising, where, for example, the platforms have special rules for political advertising in terms of disclosure and the like. But places like the New York Times and Washington Post, when they try to boost their posts on Facebook, they don't want to be seen as doing political advertising, even though essentially they're paying for political content. And so all of those lines between what is paid and unpaid, what's journalism and what's not journalism, foreign and domestic, insiders and outsiders are all blurred in the online environment. It was one thing when you could point to a television ad, right, and say, we know who is behind this ad, and there's a regulatory system which is dealing with that. And then the online environment really is the Wild West. And so we don't know how big an impact, for example, that the foreign intervention, the Russian intervention in 2016 had. You sort of have to separate out different aspects of that intervention. I think it's quite clear that the hack and leak operation had a major impact on the election because that did become a main way that people thought of the candidates. But something like $100,000 in Facebook ads, if it took $100,000 in Facebook ads to swing the election, then there are a lot of political consultants that have been misspending money for many years. And I think that the adversaries, whether foreign or domestic, have gotten much more sophisticated this time. And those lines that I was mentioning before are becoming even more difficult to draw. And the advertising strategies, the sophistication of the tools, the kind of use of organic content to try to mislead or lead voters has really developed. And the platform strategies to combat it have also become more sophisticated. And so whether it's Facebook or YouTube or the others, they've adopted a whole sort of suite of responses to try to deal with those adversaries.
Well, it's a big problem. Staying on this topic of lines of information, Dan, can the computers help us? Will artificial intelligence ever be sophisticated enough to distinguish between truth and falsehood, or otherwise deal with this propaganda problem?
Yeah. So you're asking whether artificial intelligence can actually tell truth from falsehood,
or help with the problem of misinformation? Right? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, if somebody makes a statement that it's going to rain tomorrow, clearly artificial intelligence is not going to be able to distinguish whether that's true or false. And there are many other examples that one could give. So clearly not. But I think it's still, algorithms and machine learning still have an important role to play here, which is, for example, in just keeping the conversation online more civil. So hate, harassment, bullying, that kind of speech is something that algorithms could identify and actually maybe remove. So at least the conversation online is a bit more, more pleasant and more informative to the public. So I think that's probably where the algorithms actually play an important role. But deciding truth, that's not something, artificial intelligence is not magic. Yeah, it's not going to do things that we can't even do ourselves.
So Nate, staying on this information topic, after facing intense pressure for allowing hate speech and misinformation to appear on its platform, Facebook has announced that it's going to ban new political ads from running the week before the election. They've been talking about how they're going to respond to issues of perhaps misinformation circulating about who has won the election. So what are your thoughts about these recent actions by Facebook, by the other social media companies, and how they'll impact the election and free speech?
Well, they are trying to throw a lot at the wall to see what sticks. They're not throwing everything, but they're throwing a lot, as you said. So take, for example, the political advertising rule that you mentioned. So Facebook is saying that no new political advertisements can run in the last week before Election Day. And the logic there is that every political advertisement should be amenable to counter speech, right? So that we should make it so that people, the candidates can respond to accusations about them. And so this prevents a last minute ad that will trigger, false beliefs in people. Now, there are two things to say. First of all, probably 40% of the ballots will already have been cast by the last week before the election. So because of the amount of early voting that we're talking about in this election, so it's not going to deal with that. Secondly, this doesn't deal with organic content, right? And so it actually ends up favoring those speakers who have large organic followings who don't need to rely on paid media as much. And so the paid content, right, of ads is actually a very small part, right, actually a shrinking part, I'd say, of political communication right now. Now, it will prevent some of those sort of last minute ads that might inject some falsehood into the political conversation, but it also prevents local election officials and candidates from responding in the last week to the election of organic lies that come up online. So all of these things, there are trade-offs. On the question of sort of dealing with disinformation generally, as well as like false claims of victory, this is a big problem, and the platforms are all wrestling with it. In general, both Twitter and Facebook, and I think TikTok have now decided that they're going to put friction and demotion over false claims of victory in the day after the election. And so if one of the candidates claims victory without evidence, there will be some kind of filter that's placed on on that declaration, and then that will be demoted in people's content. And that's the typical type of response that you see from social media companies to certain types of disinformation. You see that in other areas of political disinformation as well. COVID is actually an interesting exception to that, where they've been a lot more aggressive on anti-COVID disinformation. And one of the things that's really quite interesting, I think, in this election season is how the policies that were developed with respect to COVID now have spillover effects into the election, because people are asking, well, hey, if you were able to be so aggressive on medical disinformation, why can't you be more aggressive on political disinformation? And so I think they are particularly concerned about the false claims of victory. But there is a lot sort of between a false claim of victory and misleading representations of the results. And so, as in all things dealing with disinformation, it becomes a quite difficult line drawing exercise as to, well, how big a lie does it have to be before Facebook or Google or Twitter take action?
All right. Well, let's stay on the topic of what happens on November 3rd or around November 3rd this year. So, Dan, for people voting in person this fall, have there been developments in the physical voting equipment that give you some confidence that ballots will be properly accounted for? How accountable are the companies that manufacture this equipment? Who provides the oversight? How confident can we be that the votes will be fairly and accurately counted?
Yeah, so one thing that's fairly important is for people voting in person is this concept of a voter verified paper audit trail. Yeah, so that when you vote, you should see a paper, actual physical paper that captures your vote, that it captured it correctly, and that actually is then being fed into the system. Yeah, so this concept is called a voter verified paper audit trail. It's now required in multiple states. Not all, but in many states. And I hope that many of you will actually be voting, if you vote in person, I hope that many of you will be voting using an actual paper audit trail. The reason it's so important is because, as we talked about before, a post-election audit is an extremely important way to verify, to make sure the election ran correctly. And if there is a paper audit trail, we can actually do a post-election audit. Without an audit trail, there's nothing to audit. Yeah, and so that's why this is so important. For people voting by mail, one of the things that they need to make sure of is that they're actually voting using the correct envelope that was sent from the county to them. So, for example, when they send their envelope, it's a good idea to make sure that you're actually sending it to the correct address. That it's not an envelope that's pretending to be a ballot, and your vote would end up going to basically what's called in computer science dev null, meaning that your ballot will be ignored. So there are some personal things that that folks can do to protect themselves, but at a high level, the post-election audits, as we talked about, is an incredibly important step that needs to be done. It's actually good to see that multiple states now require it. Hopefully, we'll do more of it later on. In the long run, not for this election, in the long run, I hope eventually we'll move to these end-to-end verifiable systems where there's a much, much stronger guarantee that the election ran correctly. And so, like I said, there are large software companies getting into this space now. The Microsoft Election Guard system is a very well-designed system. And so, hopefully we'll see more of that being used in the future.
So Nate, vote by mail ballots, very much in the news. I know you've been working on that with the Healthy Elections Project. Are jurisdictions prepared for the onslaught of mail voting? What are the challenges you anticipate? And how well is the system going to handle that?
So some jurisdictions are more prepared than others. We here in California, I think, will do okay because roughly 2/3 of our voters have been voting by mail in recent elections anyway. A place like Arizona, where almost 80% of their votes have been cast by mail, also is going to have no problem. But places like Philadelphia, like Pennsylvania and North Carolina and Wisconsin, where they have historic rates of mail balloting around 5%, this is a major transition for them. And we should expect roughly half of the voters in those states to be moving to mail. This has required purchases of new equipment, training for election officials, as well as preparing for the surge. And all at the same time that they're dealing with all the same difficulties that we all are with respect to planning during a pandemic, right? And so it's all well and good to say, well, what you need is to have 10 people in a room counting mail ballots. Well, now that room needs to be 6 times as large as it was before. And so the mail ballots pose unique problems for voters and election officials alike. The problem of fraud that the president often touts is not a real issue, but there is certainly a perception of fraud that we see taking hold in the population. And this problem of errors in mail balloting is one that we need to really focus on. And Dan mentioned some of those, but there are many different steps in which you could lose votes, lose mail ballots. There's the application stage, there is the vote casting stage, there's the vote validation stage, and then the counting stage. Someone asked in the chat, why doesn't every state just count the votes right when they get them? Well, a lot of what happens is that they wait until election day in order to make sure that no one votes twice, that no one votes in a polling place on election day as well as voting by mail. But what we did actually in the law school just a year ago in a policy lab is we wrote the first report on signature verification, an issue that has become strangely important in the last 6 months because the main way we validate ballots is by verifying the signature of the voter against the signature that's on, say, a driver's license or voter registration card. So you could lose votes that way. The most frequent reason, or the most likely reason that a mail vote does not get counted is because of lateness, right? And so we will see hundreds of thousands of votes that will be cast too late for them to be counted this time. And so we need to make sure that the message goes out that everyone needs to vote as early as possible if they're voting by mail. Of course, the concerns about the Postal Service, which I actually think are overblown, but have really taken hold in popular consciousness, are ones that exacerbate, I think, the fears that vote by mail is going to be fraught. For that reason, many jurisdictions are installing these ballot drop boxes, allowing you to return your ballot to a polling place or an early voting center. I should say, even in those states like in the West that have historically voted by mail, like Washington, Oregon, Colorado, about half the voters or more end up actually depositing their mail ballot in something other than the U.S. Postal Service. So there is a lot that we need to do with vote by mail. We are going through sort of growing pains with it. You see it in the primary elections, places like New York, where they had thousands of ballots that ended up not being counted because of mishandling between the election officials and the Postal Service. But I'm hopeful that the baptism by fire that we saw in the primary elections will have dividends in November.
Actually, if I could add to that, I think the other thing that our listeners really should be aware of is that when you mail in your ballot or even drop it off, eventually these ballots get scanned on just on a digital scanner. This is all software that's going to be processing your ballots. So please follow the instructions and mark your ballots correctly. Marginal ballots are another reason why ballots often get discounted. So please, read the instructions and make sure you mark your ballots correctly so the machine can correctly scan your ballots.
That's good advice. Well, before we turn to questions from the audience, let me ask both of you one last question, which is, how well prepared is the country for the November election? Let's start with you, Dan.
Actually, Nate, I think this is a perfect question for you.
All right, Nate gets to go then.
We're very prepared. You all should have confidence in the vote, and I want to send that signal out. There are going to be problems on election day. There are going to be problems before election day. There are problems right now in the casting and counting of ballots, but we don't want to overstate the problems until we see them. There is incredible stress being put on the system, really unprecedented stress, and we are making a transition in our election infrastructure in such a short period of time that we have never done before. I can tell you from working with election officials around the country through our project at healthyelections.org that they are doing everything that they can under very difficult circumstances. So while I think there is cause for concern, whether it's with respect to mail ballots or polling places or the vote counting process or possible violence in the polling place or all kinds of other problems that have been ginned up because of the craziness of our politics right now, I do have more confidence now than I have had in the last 6 months that the local officials really are taking this seriously and are going to do a good job.
Well, that's reassuring to hear. So with that, I'm going to introduce Mike Friedman, the Director of Alumni Relations at Stanford School of Engineering, who is going to tee up for our panelists some of the questions from the viewers. So with that, I will turn it over to Mike.
Thank you. So we have a lot of questions. Some of them came in beforehand, before the event. So thank you to those of you who sent those in. And we also have our own little voting going on right now. And there's two questions that are neck and neck in the Q&A. Feel free to upvote questions that you see in the Q&A and feel free to submit more. The first question that's there is some of the statements at the presidential debate were interpreted by many as threats. What can be done or what is being done to protect the safety of voters in these times?
So we're actually going to issue a report on this next week at healthyelections.org. We have the students working on this right now. I should just describe what this effort is a little bit. This has been a massive undertaking that we've done at Stanford and not limited to Stanford. We've been working with the folks at MIT on this as well to both help election officials, as Jenny mentioned earlier, and also to provide the best research available on these questions. And so the issue of poll observation as well as election violence is something we're going to publish on next week. So the answer is that each state has different laws about about poll observers. And look, the fact that you have observers in polling places is not a bad thing. You want there to be transparency. You want both parties to be able to see what's going on. The problem is the line between observation and intimidation. And so there are rules that are in effect that can be enforced by the poll workers, enforced by law enforcement to make sure that there's no harassment of voters, that there's no infringement on their privacy and the like.
You touched on this a moment ago, Nate, but if you could expand on it a little bit, and perhaps Dan, you have a thought on this as well. What gives you the most assurance that our election this November will be free and fair? You have a high degree of confidence, it sounds like, but what gives you that confidence?
Well, look, I don't want to seem Pollyannish here. Look, all I do every day, which for about 23 hours a day, is worry about things for this election, right? And so I am concerned in a way I have never been about this election. Having said that, right, I can tell you that the folks who are running our elections are taking this seriously and taking reasonable steps in the battleground states in particular that I focus on to deal with these threats. So the things that I'm worried, so what gives me confidence, what causes me worry. I saw that in the chat as well. I'm actually worried. Originally, at the beginning of the summer, I was worried about the number of poll workers. I think we still have a poll worker shortage, and everybody on this call, if you can, become a poll worker and volunteer at powerthepolls.org. I think now we're going to solve the poll worker shortage problem, but now I do worry about all these new poll workers who aren't properly trained, who are going to be in the polling place, who are going to be dealing with all of these difficulties that we've been talking about. So that is something that concerns me. But there's something that's called the election administrator's prayer. And that is, oh God, whatever happens, please don't let it be close. All right, because if it's close, all of these vulnerabilities to the system are going to be seen as outcome determinative. So no matter how good a job the election officials do, if it is razor thin, even as close as it was in 2016, we will be in that scenario where everybody is arguing over the rules, everybody is contesting the ballots. And it would be, a situation like Bush versus Gore, but on steroids this time.
I'd add to that, and actually, again, encourage everyone to volunteer as poll workers, especially if you have technical expertise. I think that that would be extremely helpful because so much of our election is now run by electronic machines that you could really make a difference. At the same time, the election officials are extremely well aware of the risks that are posed now, especially given what happened in 2016, and as a result, there's as Nate said, and has actually been helping. There's a huge amount of preparation for what's coming. So that's the source of confidence.
Dan, one of the questions that's come up in a number of different ways is we do everything these days online. We bank online, and we have no problem with that. We shop online. We have apps that tell us where our family is. Everything. How far away from using this are we to voting?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, why aren't we voting online? Yeah, that is a great question. I can tell you the answer right now. In 2020, the answer is categorically, we are not prepared to vote online. We should not be voting online. Yeah, this first of all came up in a National Academy report from 2018. Nate was on that report, and even I can tell you there was a task force earlier this year that was assembled. Given the COVID crisis, should we be voting online? I was a part of that, and again, the answer was categorically no. We're not prepared to be voting online. So the answer, the reason for that is, as you might expect, is basically our end user devices, the things that you and I have on our desktops and the things that you and I have in our pockets. Right now, are simply not secure enough to support an online vote. Particularly, it'll be an invitation to hack those devices by foreign adversaries. However, having said that, I do have to say that voting online is kind of divided into two different parts, right? You could imagine ballot delivery being done online, where instead of mailing the ballot to the voter, you might imagine having the ballot, an empty ballot, being delivered online to the voter. The voter might print it at home or somewhere else, and then submit the printed, fill in the printed ballot, and then submit that. That just ballot delivery, empty ballot delivery, might actually be an option. Although, again, you have to realize this is now vulnerable to phishing attacks, where the wrong ballots are being sent to people. Although that might also affect mail-in voting, which is why it's important to make sure that when you submit your ballot by mail, you are actually mailing your ballot to the correct address. However, the other part of it is ballot submission online. That's where security is simply not there yet. Yeah. So again, our end user devices are simply not secure enough to support end user ballot submission. And we can walk through a whole litany of arguments why that's the case. Though maybe the one thing I'll say is that in 2020, this is a very, very clear answer. Even given the COVID crisis, we should not be voting online. At the same time, I have to say that security of our phones keeps getting better and better and better. Yeah, there are new features on Android and iOS that make it so that you are able to capture the voter's intent, and that's guaranteed by the hardware. Yeah? So there are new features coming through that may eventually, maybe not, certainly not today, but may eventually make it possible to vote online. Maybe. So basically, the thing to keep in mind is that in 2030, this conclusion that we should not be voting online would need to be reassessed, right? Given the security of end user devices at that point.
Can I add one thing there, which is that part of the problem here is not just whether we think that it's secure, but whether the public thinks it's secure, and whether the candidates think it's secure. And so when it comes to internet voting, you have to hypothesize a situation in which the loser of the election will have enough confidence in the result that they will concede, right? And so you can imagine in this environment, if we were just trusting it to votes going over the internet, where it's unlikely that the loser would be willing to say, yeah, I believe that it's secure and the like. And I should say one other thing, that the ballot delivery that Dan referred to is happening now. It happens in several elections, particularly what we call remote accessible vote by mail for people with disabilities, that you will often get people so that they can read it on their own devices, that you will sometimes get voters who get the ballot over the internet as well.
Actually, I want to add one more point to that, which is also voting voting online also has an access issue, in that not everybody has a phone or a laptop. So what is it? The statistics are that like 81% of US adults have a phone. 81%, that's it. It's not 99%, 81%. If you look at people over 65, it's only 53% that have a phone. And so if we do allow online voting on a phone, we might be biasing the electorate in one way or another. So that's not a technical issue. This is just a matter of access, which is another issue why it's going to take a while before online voting becomes feasible.
Thank you. I'd like to, there's a number of many other questions, but I'd like to see if we can put this in a little bit of context and ask a question to Dean Martinez. Jenny, from your perspective as a scholar of international law, of constitutional law, comparative constitutional law, what is the fact that we're having this conversation right now, 30 days before Election Day, tell us about the safety and security of voting in the US relative to other countries, and perhaps more broadly, even where we are as a democracy right now?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think on the first issue, one thing that is quite distinctive about the US compared to a number of other countries is the decentralized nature of our voting system. So in many countries, there's a lot more control by the national government about how an election is run, which makes it easier to put in place uniform procedures, uniform practices. And in the US, we have a system of federalism under our Constitution, and then it devolves things out to the 50 states, and then the states send it down to the local level. And so that means we have all kinds of different systems for everything from the types of voting machines to the procedures for getting mail-in ballots and things like that. And so when you've seen even other democracies that have had elections during the COVID crisis, for example, they have had an easier time getting procedures in place in terms of health and safety because of that centralized control. The second thing, in terms of the doubt and concern in the public about the integrity of the election process, is something that is not what we commonly see in the United States, and is more reminiscent of the doubts we see in a lot of other countries that have had less of a history of stable democracy, in terms of the public being confident that the election will be fairly run and the votes will all be counted. And I think here in the United States, we're seeing the confluence of just a variety of troubling trends, from the pandemic and the challenges that has posed to the system, the online information environment that Nate was talking about, voter suppression efforts that have gone on for a number of years, and a national discourse that throws into doubt the integrity of the process. And so I think that it is concerning to see that level of public worry, because it's not just the security of the system itself, it's the level of public confidence in the results. And I hope that when we look back on this election, we will have learned some valuable lessons for the future, that we can take steps to ensure that we don't find ourselves in this situation again, and that we return to a more stable environment in the period leading up to elections.
Nate, thank you. Nate, I know behind you, you have some, I suppose, artifacts from other elections that were disputed in various ways. Maybe the same question in a way to you. can you put this into some context, some historical context about, we've had these kinds of issues before. Where do things go from here if things are contested, as it looks like may indeed be the case?
Well, I want to say one thing, which is that some of these issues we've never had before. Okay, and that this is an unprecedented election in many respects, and dealing with I mean, one of the reasons I dropped everything, including much of what of the work we were doing at the Cyber Center to work on these healthy elections questions, is because the pandemic has posed novel questions for the administration of this election, novel questions for election administrators, novel questions for voters. And so we are, walking in new snow here, and I think it's quite important that we recognize that. Having said that, it's not as if this were the contested election that this is the only one that we've had. Whether it's 1876 or 2000, we've gone through contested and close elections. 1960 even in close. This is, as you mentioned, this is my Palm Beach butterfly ballot machine that I take out when I teach Bush versus Gore to my students, and I see how many of them can vote correctly, and usually about 5% make a mistake, and so it's Bush versus Gore in the 2000 election, because it's fresh to some extent in everyone's mind, 20 years old as it is the filter or the lens through which we will be viewing election controversies, I think, and so we assume that the courts are going to play a very significant role. That is not necessarily the way the framers intended it. That's why we have sort of an electoral college, and we have this machinery that involves the House of Representatives and the like. But I think everyone expects the courts to be aggressively involved. That is why the death of Justice Ginsburg at this particular time, while tragic on its own terms, is for the election, poses a real challenge, because we don't have the full complement of justices on the Supreme Court, and there's the possibility of 4-4 ties and the like. And so I think that we will be, if it is a close election, we will expect that the courts, both at the state level and in the federal system, ultimately the Supreme Court, will get involved. But we also could be dealing with completely new issues like competing slates of electors, which some people in the chat had talked about. I want to emphasize that I think these are not likely scenarios, right? But we will know on election night which world we live in, right? Is this a world in which there's a clear winner, or is this one where we're going to be slogging it out in court and using the sort of constitutional machinery? And so I want to emphasize that to people, because there's a sense in which we're going to have to wait 2 weeks before we know anything. And the answer is no. We're going to know a lot on election night and in the day after. I wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal last week on this. And so it's not exactly right that we should just sort of hold back and not release some of the information that those at the networks will have.
Although because of vote by mail, it's going to take a while to count all the votes.
So this is one misconception, which is that it always takes a month to count all the votes, right? But now there are going to be more that are potentially uncounted. The question is, at what stage will we be able to reliably call the election or predict who the victor is? And the answer is, it depends on the state. Some people also put in the chat questions about why can't we process the ballots right when we get them? Processing meaning verifying the signatures and the like. And states do that. So Florida starts processing ballots 3 weeks before the election. Pennsylvania and Michigan do it on election day, right? And they wait until election day in order to open up to verify the ballots. And so unfortunately, several of the battleground states are in that position where it will take them a while perhaps to count the ballots. But that doesn't mean we will have no information even from those states, because some of those states will get pretty complete returns from certain counties, and we can extrapolate from some of those counties what some of the other counties may have done. But if it's as close as 2000 or even as close as 2016, we're going to be in for the long haul. It's going to take several days and maybe weeks for us to figure out who won.
Dan, are there technical capabilities that we have that can help us really quickly confirm the validity and the legitimacy of the election, of the votes and the election results?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, so by the way, just building on what Nate just said, many counties actually provide online tracking tools where you can make sure that your ballot was actually received. And in fact, it's quite encouraged that after you mail in your ballot, maybe you wait a few days and go and make sure that your ballot was actually received by the system. That's a good way to flag any errors. If the signature match issue came up, then that's a good way to fix that. So just look up at your county's system and make sure your ballot was received correctly. And then in terms of verifying the election, as I said, there are many counties that actually require, several states that require post-election audits, and this is the best way to make sure that things were run correctly. A post-election audit doesn't mean a full recount. Yeah, there's probabilistic methods that do probabilistic recounts, probabilistic checks that ballots were actually counted correctly, scanned correctly, and so those are very important tools that they increase the public confidence in the election system. And so hopefully more states will adopt that over time. Right now, not everyone, it's not a requirement in all states, but the ones that do, I applaud them, and definitely it helps our confidence in the system.
Can you, related to the sort of the confidence in the security that we have, can you talk a little bit about how easy it is or not to hack into a voting booth or a voting system?
Yeah, so I think everybody has to remember that there's no such thing as a hack-proof system. Yeah, every system is, unless it's completely turned off and never used. If a system is used, it's hackable. Yeah, I mean that's just a fact of life with not just computers. It's also a fact of life in the physical world, right? There's no hack-proof safe, and we live with it. Yeah, so those are risks that we know how to accept. So you're asking about the specific security of systems that are currently in use. Well, I can tell you that, for example, there are these hacking conferences. I think DEF CON is a very famous hacking conference. And every year for the last 3 years, they've had an election equipment testing competition. They call it the Election Village. And they publish a report. And the report from 2019 basically shows that they're able to hack effectively all the systems that they've examined. So yes, I mean, these systems, like we said, every system is hackable in principle, but the fact that you can perhaps compromise one component of the election system, just let's say the scanner, doesn't mean that you can compromise the whole system if you properly do post-election audits and so on. So there are definitely, until we move to these end-to-end verifiable election systems, there will be cybersecurity issues with the equipment, but there are ways to recover from that using appropriate use of audits.
Let me say one thing on this, which is that even before the COVID crisis, because of technological changes at the state level, 85% of voters would have voted in some way on paper. Now, I say in some way because sometimes that paper is then marked by a ballot marking device, which involves technology, which is potentially hackable, but you would have some kind of paper trail that could potentially be audited. My guess is that because of rises in absentee voting, it's going to be well over 90% of voters who are going to end up voting on paper in some way or another this time.
And so we're going to have a paper audit trail that can be checked. Yeah.
I mean, for most, and in the most important states, that's true as well. I mean, the biggest state that was the problem child on this was Georgia, and then Georgia made the switch in the last year to new types of technology. It's not like aren't problems with that technology, and in particular, the lack of training that some of the poll workers had with that technology, but it's not behind a black box where you just sort of do it electronically and you don't have any record of it.
Well, one thing to add to that is some of the ballot marking equipment actually generates just a QR code, which the voter can't actually tell whether the QR code correctly captured the vote, and that's a bit problematic. Yeah, when we talk about paper audit trails, we mean a voter verified paper audit trail, that you can literally look at the paper and make sure that your vote was captured correctly, so it could be checked afterwards. Even with verifying paper audit trails, there have been a number of papers on how to do that properly. So I encourage you to go look at Alex Halderman's website. There's like a number of beautiful papers that he wrote. He's been doing election security now for a while. That he wrote on how to properly audit an election and how to improperly audit an election. And so that his papers are actually a good way to educate yourself on what's possible and what's not.
So we have time for one more question, and I'd like to pose it to all three of you. I think it's an important question. We're living, I think it's fair to say, in a time where a lot of people are fearful about quite a number of different things, and election security, of course, is just one of them. how can the security community, the media, the academic community, the legal community, do a better job of appropriately communicating the security of elections so as to be honest and forthright, but to not cause unnecessary fear?
Nate, do you want to start with that?
Well, let me tell you one thing that we're trying to do, and this is not just in the security realm, but in the sort of COVID adaptation realm in general. Let me agree with something that's been said in chat, which is that, look, we live in such polarized times right now, and this election is very different than the 2000 election, and our skin is extremely thin, and the country is under unprecedented stress. And so in that environment, how do you build voters' expectations so that they are realistic about what the process is about? And so when it comes to not just security, but also, for example, the post-election processing of ballots, how ballots are counted, that it's not going to be manipulated, we are trying to amplify the voices of local election officials who actually do this work to try to demystify the process and to tell people what actually happens. We have in our mind a document that will be what to expect when you're expecting election results, and so that people can be prepared for what's going to happen after the fact. On the security question, I'll defer to Dan on this, but I think that, look, you need to, I think Dan did the right way. He said, look, nothing is safe. We need, nothing is unhackable technology, but that we build in as much security as we can, and we compare it to other aspects of our life, right, where we deal with similar risks. And that's also one thing we've tried to do. One thing we paired up with the design school to develop a guide to healthy polling places, and part of that is to explain, well, this is the ways to mitigate the risks in voting during the pandemic.
I think one of the most important things is just to encourage the general public to get out to vote, right? I mean, to not let these concerns about what might go wrong deter people from casting their ballots. And it's more important this year than ever that people make a plan for how they're going to vote, when they're going to vote, and then carry out that plan and make sure that they cast their ballot. And the more people who vote, the better off we'll be as a country.
Then track their ballot and make sure that it was received. And there are online systems that will let you do that.
Yeah.
And vote early. Get it over with now if you can.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we've come to an end of this event. I want to thank our panelists, Jenny, Dan, and Nate, for your really interesting and important insights. Thank you to my colleagues at Stanford School of Engineering, Stanford Law School, Stanford Alumni Association for putting this event together. And of course, thank you to the audience for joining us and for your questions. If you are eligible to vote, please do so. We absolutely encourage that. Thank you again.